The summer of 1878 didn't just heat the Missouri Valley, it punished it. By the second week of July, the corn was withering on the stalk, and the ambient temperature hovered near 100 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 days straight. Neighbors were scrambling to save their winter meat, burying it in salt or smoking it until it was like leather. They were fighting the heat with chemistry. Asher Jones was fighting it with physics. While the rest of the county sweated through the night, Asher opened a heavy, sawdust-packed door in the side of a hill. Inside, the air wasn't just cool, it was freezing. A thermometer placed on the stack read 28 degrees. It wasn't a miracle. It was a precise manipulation of phase change and thermal mass that began 6 months earlier, when the river was stone dead. To understand the cold of July, you have to stand in the wind of January. The work didn't begin when the snow fell. It began when the ice sang. That's the sound the river makes when it thickens past the 10-inch mark. A deep, resonant cracking that echoes off the valley walls. For Asher, 10 inches wasn't enough. He waited for 12. 12 inches meant the blocks would have the structural integrity to survive the haul and the mass to survive the summer. The neighbors watched him from their windows. In the dead of winter, when the calories were precious and the wood stove was the only friend a man had, Asher was out on the river. He wasn't fishing. He was farming a crop that wouldn't be ripe for half a year. He started by clearing the snow. This was the first mistake the amateurs made, and the first lesson in thermodynamics. Snow is an insulator. If you leave it on the ice, it keeps the river warm, slowing the freeze. But worse, if you let the snow freeze into the ice, you get snow ice, white, bubbly, and porous. We tested this distinction during our reconstruction. We cut 2 blocks, one clear, one white. The white ice is filled with trapped air pockets. In a storage pit, those pockets are structural weaknesses. They increase the surface area for melting. Asher needed clear ice, laminar ice. He scraped the river clean, exposing the black glass of the water to the sub-zero air, forcing it to freeze deeper, harder, and clearer. Then came the grid. He didn't just hack at the surface, he measured. A 22-inch square. This wasn't an arbitrary number. It was the maximum size a grown man could lift with tongs without blowing out his back, and a standardized unit that allowed for tight stacking. Gaps in the stack are death. Gaps allow air circulation, and air circulation brings heat. The blocks had to fit together like masonry. We took a vintage cross-cut ice saw out to the lake to replicate the labor. The first thing you notice is the sound. It's a rhythmic, grinding tear. The second thing you notice is the calorie burn. Sawing ice isn't like sawing wood. The friction creates water, which refreezes instantly if you stop, binding the blade. You have to keep moving. We measured the output. A man working the ice harvest burns nearly 600 calories an hour. It is brutal, repetitive, freezing work. In 1878, the locals thought Asher was mad. They saw a man burning his winter energy reserves to cut frozen water that would just melt in the spring. They didn't understand that he wasn't harvesting water. He was harvesting cold. He was banking thermal energy. Every block he pulled from the river was a battery charged with winter, waiting to be discharged in July. The extraction was a process of leverage. Asher used a long iron spud bar to break the final seam of the grid, floating the 22-inch islands down a channel cut into the ice. They moved effortlessly in the water, buoyant and light. But the moment they hit the bank, reality set in. 200 pounds of dead weight, slippery, hard, and dangerous. He loaded them onto the sled, wrapping them in canvas not to keep them warm, but to keep the sun off. Even in January, the sun is an enemy. Getting the ice out of the river was simple labor. It was just heavy lifting. But keeping it frozen through a humid Missouri August required something more than muscle. It required an understanding of a number that wouldn't be written down in physics textbooks for another generation. The ice was just the fuel. The engine was the pit. Most people look at a block of ice and see a cold rock. They think it cools a cellar simply because it is cold, radiating a chill into the surrounding air, like a wood stove radiates heat. But that is a misunderstanding of how energy moves. Cold does not radiate. Cold is simply the absence of heat. To keep a cellar at 28 degrees in the middle of a Missouri July, You don't need a source of cold. You need a sponge for heat. You need something that can absorb the punishing thermal energy of the summer sun without rising in temperature itself. This is where Asher Jones understood something his neighbors missed. He wasn't building an icebox. He was building a phase change battery. The physics of this battery relies on a concept called the latent heat of fusion. It is the hidden math that governs the transition from solid to liquid. If you take a pound of water at 33 degrees Fahrenheit and cool it down to 32 degrees, you have removed 1 British thermal unit, or BTU, of energy. That is sensible heat. You can feel the change. But here is the anomaly that makes the system work. To turn that 32-degree water into 32-degree ice, to actually make it lock into a solid crystal, you have to remove another 144 BTUs. The temperature doesn't drop a single degree during this process. It stays flat at 32. The energy doesn't go into changing the temperature. It goes into forging the bonds of the crystal lattice. This creates a massive energy deficit. That block of ice is now holding a debt of 144 BTUs for every single pound of weight. When July arrives, the equation reverses. The heat of the summer tries to warm the cellar. It hits the ice stack. But before the ice can warm up to 33 degrees, it has to pay back that energy debt. It has to absorb 144 BTUs of heat just to turn back into water at the same temperature. It is a thermal toll booth. The heat enters, but the temperature doesn't rise. The energy is simply consumed by the phase change. Asher understood that this battery only works if the capacity is massive. This brings us to the second part of his equation, the geometry of mass. You cannot store a single block of ice through the summer. A single block has too much surface area relative to its volume. The heat attacks the skin, and the core vanishes. To survive 6 months of dormancy, you need a critical mass. You need to minimize the surface area where the attack happens, and maximize the volume where the cold lives. Asher didn't stack his harvest in random piles. He built a solid cube. He packed the 22-inch blocks tight, shaving the sides so they sat flush, creating a monolith. By our calculations, his minimum viable mass was 10 tons. Anything less than 10 tons loses the war against surface area. A 10-ton cube of ice creates its own microclimate. It possesses so much thermal inertia that the outer layout acts as a shield. The heat attacks the outside, paying the BTU toll to melt the surface, while the core remains untouched, protected by the sacrifice of the perimeter. This explains why the neighbors failed. We found records of farmers in the same county trying to keep ice in shallow dugouts or wrapped in straw in their barns. They treated the ice like a precious jewel, wrapping small chunks in heavy blankets. They failed because they didn't understand the scale of the thermal load. They were bringing a cup of water to a forest fire. They assumed insulation was the solution, thinking that if they just wrapped it tight enough, the cold would stay. But insulation only slows the heat transfer. It doesn't stop it. Eventually, the heat gets through. And when it does, if you don't have the mass, if you don't have those millions of BTUs of latent heat debt waiting to be paid, the system collapses. Asher's system was designed to take the hit. He knew the heat would come. He knew the insulation would eventually be breached. But he had built a battery with such a deep capacity that it could absorb the punishment for months without breaking a sweat. However, a battery is only effective if it holds its charge. And like any battery, if you puncture the casing, the energy drains away. For an ice house, the leak isn't electricity. The leak is water. And if you don't manage the melt, the very thing that saves you will eventually destroy you. Asher didn't break ground in the flat pasture, where the digging would have been easy. He walked to the north-facing slope of the ravine behind his barn. This was a calculated decision based on solar geometry. The north slope spends its winter in perpetual shadow, and its summer in oblique, filtered light. By digging into the hill, Asher wasn't just creating a space, he was enlisting the earth as an ally. The soil temperature in the Missouri Valley, once you get 6 feet below the frost line, stabilizes at roughly 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. It doesn't matter if the air above is 20 below or 110. The deep earth holds the line. But digging the hole was only the beginning of the engineering challenge. The moment you create a subterranean cavity for ice, you introduce a paradox that destroys most root cellars. You are storing a solid that is destined to become a liquid. Asher knew that despite his best efforts, the outer layer of his ice stack would melt. This sacrificial melt is part of the system's defense. However, that water creates a lethal problem. If the meltwater pools at the bottom of the pit, it touches the base of the ice stack. This is where the physics of conduction becomes ruthless. Stationary air is a decent insulator, but water is a conductor. Water conducts heat away from, or into, a source 20 times faster than air. If the bottom blocks of Asher's harvest sat in even an inch of 33-degree meltwater, the thermal transfer would skyrocket. The water would act as a bridge, pulling the 55-degree heat from the earth floor directly into the ice, bypassing the air gap entirely. The stack would rot from the bottom up. To save the harvest, the water had to leave immediately. The obvious solution is a drain pipe. But a simple pipe is a double-edged sword. While it lets water out, it creates a highway for air to get in. In the summer, the heavy, cold air inside the pit wants to sink, flowing out of the drain like water. As that cold air leaves, it creates a vacuum that pulls warm, humid summer air in through the cracks of the door. This is the stack effect in reverse. A straight drain pipe turns an ice house into a convection oven. Asher's solution was the trapped drain. It is a piece of plumbing logic that predates modern codes. He dug a trench at the lowest point of the floor and lined it with flat river stones. He didn't just slope it outward, he built a depression, a stone bowl that dipped below the exit level before rising again to meet the outflow channel. It was a primitive P-trap, identical in principle to the pipe under your kitchen sink. When the first trickle of meltwater ran down the stack, it filled this stone bowl. Once the bowl was full, the excess water flowed out, but the bowl remained full. That standing water acted as a cork. It created an airtight seal that blocked the tunnel. The water could push its way out, but the air could not push its way in. The cold air inside the pit was trapped, unable to escape through the floor, maintaining the high pressure required to keep the heat out. In our reconstruction of Asher's design, we installed a transparent version of this trap to verify the physics. We used smoke to trace the airflow. With a straight pipe, the smoke rushed out of the floor drain, driven by the weight of the cold air. The moment we filled the trap with water, the smoke stopped dead. The seal held. The pit became a static thermal environment. With the drain mechanics solved, Asher turned his attention to the floor composition. He didn't stack the ice on the dirt. He laid down a bed of coarse river gravel, 6 inches deep, to ensure rapid percolation. But on top of the gravel, he added a layer that most modern builders would forget: charcoal. He took charred wood from his winter fires and crushed it into a coarse powder, spreading it over the stones. Charcoal is carbon, and carbon is a filter. In the damp, dark environment of an ice pit, mold and slime are inevitable. They clog drains and foul the air. The charcoal layer absorbed the organic impurities from the meltwater, keeping the drain clear and the air sweet. The foundation was now set. He had a north-facing cavity anchored in stable earth, a floor that drained instantly, and a seal that locked the atmosphere. The pit was a cold, dry vessel waiting for its cargo. But the ice couldn't touch the walls. The earth was 55 degrees, and the ice was 32. If they touched, the earth would win. To bridge that gap, Asher needed a liner, but he couldn't use stone. In the world of thermodynamics, stone is a traitor. It is dense, conductive, and eager to transfer energy. Solid stone has an R value of roughly 0.08 per inch. A 12-inch stone wall gives you an R value of less than 1. You might as well leave the door open. Asher couldn't afford granite, which was his greatest advantage. He needed a material that was effectively dead air. Asher used the waste product of the timber industry, pine sawdust. He didn't treat it as garbage. He treated it as an engineered material. In the physics of insulation, the goal is to trap air. Still air is one of the best insulators in nature, but it must be immobilized. Sawdust is essentially millions of microscopic timber cells, each trapping a tiny pocket of air, piled together in a chaotic matrix that prevents flow. It is the wool of the woods. Depending on the density and the species, packed pine sawdust yields an R value of roughly 2.5 per inch. Asher packed a 12-inch gap between his ice stack and the earthen walls. That gave him a thermal shield rated at R30. For comparison, the walls of the modern home you are sitting in right now are likely rated at R13 or R19. Asher Jones, in 1878, had built a thermal envelope twice as efficient as a 21st century living room, using nothing but dirt and dust. He applied this insulation using a technique often called the chimney method, though it functions in reverse. He didn't push the ice tight against the wall. He built a freestanding cube of ice in the center of the pit, leaving a 1-foot gap on all 4 sides. As the stack rose, he filled this gap with the sawdust, tamping it down with a heavy wooden pestle. This created a continuous, monolithic blanket that wrapped the sides of the harvest. It allowed the structure to breathe, letting moisture escape, without letting the air draft. But insulation was only the first line of defense. Asher understood a brutal reality that most novices refuse to accept. You cannot save everything. To keep the core frozen, the edges must die. He designed the system around a sacrificial layer, calculating that the outer 6 inches of his stack were destined to melt. This was a strategic loss. The neighbors who failed were the ones who tried to save every ounce, checking the ice constantly, fretting over the melt. Asher simply accepted the casualty rate. He sacrificed the perimeter to hold the center. The final step in the packing process was internal. The stack itself had to be solid. If there were gaps between the 22-inch blocks, air would find them. Air inside the stack creates convection loops, miniature weather systems where air warms against the top, rises, cools against the ice, and falls, grinding away the harvest from the inside out. Asher eliminated this by chinking the ice. He took the snow ice he had scraped off the river surface, the porous white ice he rejected for storage, and crushed it into a fine powder. He jammed this powder into every vertical seam between the blocks, then poured water over it. The water froze instantly, fusing the separate blocks into a single 10-ton monolith. There were no cracks. There was no airflow. There was just one massive, dormant glacier, wrapped in 12 inches of pine wool, sitting in a stone-drained pit, waiting for the sun. The door was sealed, the sawdust topped off, and the long wait began. The hardest part of the harvest wasn't the sawing of the grid or the hauling of the sleds. It was the trusting. As February turned to March, the visible signs of winter vanished from the Missouri Valley. The river ice broke apart, sending the shards downstream to vanish in the Mississippi. The heavy gray skies lifted, replaced by the pale, warming blue of spring. The neighbors, who had watched Asher's labor with amusement, returned to their plows. To them, the mound on the north slope was just a curiosity, a grave for a fool's errand. The grass grew over the sod roof, disguising the structure until it looked like nothing more than a natural heave in the hillside. For Asher Jones, this was the season of discipline. The temptation to open the heavy, sawdust-packed door was constant. There is a human need to verify, to check if the work holds, to see if the ice is still solid. But Asher understood that in the thermodynamics of cold storage, curiosity is a calorie expenditure the system cannot afford. A door is not just a barrier, it is a valve, and he knew that the air inside his pit was behaving not like a gas, but like a fluid. Cold air is denser than warm air. It is heavy. In a perfectly sealed pit, the cold air settles into the lowest point, pooling around the ice stack like water in a bucket. It creates a stratification layer, a heavy, invisible blanket that insulates the ice from the warmer air near the ceiling. This is the convection defense. But the moment you crack that door to peek inside, you allow the heavy, cold air to spill out across your boots, and the vacuum pulls the warm, humid spring air into the void. To check the ice is to melt the ice. So, Asher left the door shut. We monitored this invisible battle during our reconstruction using buried thermal sensors. We placed probes at 1-foot intervals through the soil of the north slope to watch the heat move. What we saw was the phenomenon of thermal lag. The Earth does not conduct heat instantly, it resists it. The heat of the first warm day in April strikes the surface, but it takes time to travel down. The soil dampens the thermal pulse. Our data showed that the heat travels through the clay soil at a rate of roughly 1 inch per day. This means that when the surface temperature spikes in May, The soil 6 feet down, right where the heart of Asher's ice stack sat, is still experiencing the thermal reality of March. The Earth acts as a time machine. It delays the arrival of summer underground. While the air temperature in the valley was climbing into the 70s and 80s, the thermal envelope surrounding the ice was still lingering in the 40s. But 1878 was not a normal year. As June arrived, the weather turned hostile. It wasn't just the heat, it was the moisture. The valley acted as a funnel for the humidity rising from the Gulf, creating a thick, oppressive atmosphere that stuck to the skin. This corn sweat is dangerous for ice storage. Dry air is a poor conductor of heat, but moist air is efficient. It carries more thermal energy per cubic foot. The humidity was attacking the outer seal of the pit, trying to drive the heat through the sawdust and into the stack. Asher watched the sky. He watched the corn shoot up, fed by the sweltering nights. He recorded the dates in his ledger, noting the unusual lack of evening cooling. The nights stayed hot. The wood of his barn expanded and groaned. The butter in his kitchen turned to oil. The neighbors' smokehouses began to struggle, the heat penetrating the curing rooms, threatening the winter's meat supply. By late June, the external pressure was immense. The heat pulse was finally reaching the depth of the pit. The thermal lag had run its course, and the 55-degree stability of the Earth was being tested by the relentless, soaking warmth of the surface. The soil sensors in our rebuild showed the temperature curve beginning to tick upward, degree by degree. The buffer was thinning. The ice was no longer protected by the memory of winter stored in the ground. It was now fighting the reality of summer on its own. And then came July. The atmosphere stagnated over the Midwest, locking the heat in place. The high-pressure dome pushed the mercury past 90, then past 95. The wind died. The valley baked. It was the kind of heat that breaks things. It cracked the mud in the river bottoms and wilted the leaves of the oaks. It was the moment the system was built for. The neighbors were losing their preservation battles, their salt cures failing in the humidity. They looked to the north slope, wondering if anything survived in the mound. Asher didn't wonder. He waited. He knew the math. But math is cold comfort when the world is burning. The true test had arrived. The first week of August brought a stillness to the valley that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The corn was tall but suffering. The leaves curled tight against the midday glare. The ambient temperature had touched 98 degrees for 3 consecutive days. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the road, distorting the horizon. In the root cellars of the county, the battle was already lost. The passive cooling of standard dugouts had been overwhelmed by the duration of the heat wave. The internal temperatures had crept up into the 60s, turning potatoes soft and milk sour in hours. Asher Jones walked up the north slope with a shovel in one hand and an iron pry bar in the other. He didn't rush. The mound looked unchanged, a silent, grass-covered hump in the hillside that gave no indication of what lay beneath. The only sign of the structure was the heavy timber door, bleached gray by the sun, sealed tight against the frame. He hadn't opened it since the last freeze of March. He wedged the pry bar into the latch mechanism. The wood had swollen in the summer humidity, fighting him for a moment before groaning open. He didn't swing the door wide. He cracked it just enough to slip through. The sensory shift was violent. It wasn't a gradual cooling. It was a physical wall. The smell hit him first. Not the musty earthen rot of a failed cellar, but the sharp, clean scent of damp pine. It smelled like a sawmill in the rain. Then came the visual evidence. As the door swung wide, the moisture instantly condensed. A thick, rolling fog materialized out of thin air, tumbling out of the doorway and swirling around his boots. Asher stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind him, sealing the light out. He lit a lantern. The flames sputtered in the heavy, cold air. He was standing in the antechamber, facing the sawdust wall. The top layer of the packing material looked discouraging. It was dark, heavy, and sodden. To an untrained eye, it looked like failure. The moisture from the humidity had been absorbed by the pine wool, just as intended, but it gave the appearance of a swamp. He drove the shovel into the top of the stack. The first 6 inches came away with a wet slap, a heavy, saturated mash of wood pulp. This was the sacrificial layer. It had done its job, drinking the heat and holding the moisture. He dug deeper. At 8 inches, the texture changed. The sawdust became lighter, drier. The color shifted from dark brown to fresh yellow. And then, at 12 inches down, the steel blade of the shovel rang out. It wasn't the dull thud of hitting dirt. It was the high, sharp clink of striking stone. Asher cleared the loose shavings with his gloved hand. Beneath the insulation, the surface wasn't wet. It was dry. It was a sheet of black, laminar glass, perfectly preserved from the January river. He pressed his bare hand against it. It was so cold, it burned. He chipped a small fragment loose and held it to the lantern light. It was clear, solid, and hard. The thermometer he had left on the stack confirmed the victory. The air temperature in the pit was 34 degrees. The ice surface temperature was 28. He had lost perhaps 10% of the total mass to the sacrificial melt, the tax paid to the summer sun. But the remaining 90% was intact. The battery still held its charge. When he emerged from the pit carrying a block the size of a loaf of bread, the fog followed him out like a ghost. He walked down to the main road where his neighbor, the same man who had laughed at the snow farming in January, was trying to fix a wagon wheel in the sweltering heat. Asher didn't say anything. He just set the block of ice on the fence post. It sat there, glistening in the sun, a piece of impossible winter sitting in the middle of the dog days. The neighbor stopped his work. He looked at the ice, then up at the north slope, and finally at Asher. The laughter was gone. The physics had arrived. We calculated the raw energy equivalent of Asher's 10-ton stack to understand the true scale of his achievement. A 10-ton cube of ice holds roughly 2.8 million BTUs of cooling potential. To replicate that kind of thermal suppression using modern electricity, you would need to run a standard chest freezer continuously for nearly 2 years. But the difference between Asher's pit and a modern appliance isn't just measured in kilowatt hours. It is measured in independence. Modern refrigeration is an act of brute force. We burn coal or natural gas to generate electricity, which spins a turbine, which powers a compressor, to violently pump heat out of an insulated box. It is a loud, active, and fragile process that fights against the environment. Asher's system was silent. It was passive. The energy didn't come from a power plant. It came from the phase change of the river itself. He didn't create the cold. He simply captured it when it was abundant and released it when it was scarce. Somewhere between the invention of Freon and the expansion of the rural power grid, we lost this relationship with thermal mass. We traded the reliability of physics for the convenience of a switch. But today, the principles Asher used are finding their way back into the blueprints of earthships, passive solar homes, and high-performance root cellars. You don't need a frozen river to apply them. The physics haven't changed, only our willingness to use them. There is a distinct resilience in this old wisdom that modern technology cannot match. A modern freezer is arguably more convenient, but it has a fatal weakness: the wire. If the grid fails during a heat wave, which is exactly when the grid is most likely to fail, the clock starts ticking. You have 48 hours before the physics catches up with you. The ice melts, the food spoils, and the system collapses. Asher Jones's system had no wire. It had no moving parts to break, no coolant to leak, and no compressor to seize. It didn't care about the economy or the infrastructure. As long as the winter came, the system worked. It was an infrastructure of one, built on the absolute certainty of the seasons. The final lesson here isn't that we should all go back to sawing ice by hand. It is that we should stop fighting the climate and start leveraging it. We spend so much energy trying to defeat the weather, heating against the cold, cooling against the heat. Asher showed us that if you understand the cycle, you don't have to fight. You just have to wait. You take the excess of January to solve the deficit of July. That block of ice sitting on the fence post in 1878 wasn't just frozen water. It was a physical receipt for a transaction made with nature 6 months prior. It proved that the most advanced technology isn't always a machine. Sometimes, it's just a man who knows where to dig. If you want to learn more about the engineering we left behind, subscribe to the channel. We have more blueprints to dust off.